Good morning. My name's Ken Wilcox. 32 years ago, I was teaching at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I was teaching something totally unrelated to what we're here for today. I was teaching German language and German literature and German history and German philosophy, and I was restless. I was a little bored. I wanted to do something that had more of an impact. So I quit, and I sold everything I owned, except for my clothes. And I went to Boston, and I joined Harvard Business School as a beginning MBA student. Shortly after I got there, I met my wife. She wasn't a student, but I met her and I introduced myself, and we've been together ever since. She's actually here in Seoul today, visiting museums and learning about Korean culture. She loves art, she loves culture, she loves history. After I graduated from Harvard Business School in 1983, I joined a bank in Boston called Shawmut. It doesn't exist anymore. It's part of Bank of America. The first thing I did when I got to Shawmut was get a position working with technology companies, venture-backed technology companies. So why technology? Technology because I felt that through working with technology companies, I could have, in my own small way, an impact on the world. Maybe I could help finance a technology company that would do something wonderful for people someday and make people's lives better. Maybe a cure for a disease. And the older you get, the more important that feels, I can tell you. Maybe some kind of productivity device. Anyway, I wanted to do that, and I got in this position, and right away, starting in 1983, I was working with technology companies that were venture-backed. Well, why venture-backed? And that's because if you're going to solve a big problem, you need to grow, and to grow, you need to have equity. So I wanted to work with companies that not only had the potential to solve a big problem, but also the equity that would enable them to grow. And then I would be there to provide the debt to make that equity last longer. And I'll talk more about that later, because that's one of my 4 key points. Because I'm going to make 4 key points. When I make one, I'll tell you. So eventually I got to Silicon Valley Bank, and actually since 1983 I've only done the same thing my whole adult life now, and that is all I've done is worked with young entrepreneurs who are trying to solve problems that will make the world a better place, who are backed by venture capitalists or other people who have equity, and I'm there trying to provide debt to make the equity to go further, and maybe a little bit of advice and help along the way. So in the year 2000, I became CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. And 2 years ago, I retired, sort of. 2 years ago, I turned 63. I decided it was time to retire. And then I decided it really wasn't time to retire. So I went to China. And my good wife went with me. We went on behalf of Silicon Valley Bank. We formed a joint venture with a bank called Pudong Development Bank, also called PUFA. So we now have, we meaning Silicon Valley Bank on the one side and PUFA on the other side, we have, for the first time in 5,000 years of Chinese history, the first, and thus far only, joint venture commercial bank between an American commercial bank and a Chinese commercial bank that is focused on supporting companies in the innovation space. So that's what I've been doing for the past 2 years. Love China, fascinating place, huge adventure, big challenge, and of course very difficult. And I think you probably all are very much familiar with the subtitle of China. The title is China. The subtitle is All Things Possible, Everything Extremely Difficult. And that's my life today. Kyung Yun gave me an invitation to come and speak here today. I was thrilled. I've never been in Korea. So I'm in a learning mode. So far, so good. But I've only been here a day. But very, very nice. I have only positive things to say about Korea right now. One word about my bank, my original bank, Silicon Valley Bank, because so few people know us. You know, there are 8,000 banks in the United States. Most of them are meaningless. They're tiny. They're owned by one family. They only do a tiny thing. There are about 250 banks in the U.S. that are big enough that Wall Street pays attention to them. Of those 250, we are the biggest of the little ones. We're the littlest of the big ones. We're the 50th largest. And the only people who know us, who recognize our name, are technology companies. Only technology companies. Mostly venture-backed or soon-to-be venture-backed, because of my deep belief that to make a difference, you have to grow. To grow, you need equity and debt combined. So in the year 2000, we started planting our seeds in other continents. We'd already been going for years and years to the Pacific Rim. We've been coming, actually, other people from my bank have been in Korea now, off and on again, for well over 20 years. We started going to Hong Kong. We started going to Singapore. We started going to Taiwan. We had a brief romance with Japan. And then in 1999, we started going to the PRC. And we went to India. Today, we have operations in the UK, big operations. We have pretty big operations in Israel, given the size of Israel. We have pretty big operation now in China. We have pretty big operations in India. So what I want to talk with you about today, as we go around the globe, we focus a lot on differences. We talk about the differences in culture, the differences in regulation, the differences in law. And we focus on those because we know to be successful, we always have to adapt ourselves to local conditions. But I don't want to talk about differences today. I want to talk about universals. Because even though there are major differences between all of these innovation markets, I believe from all these years of spending time, now 2 years solid in Shanghai, I believe from spending time in all these markets that there are some universals. And that it's helpful to think about the universals, not just the differences. And when I think about the universals in light of Korea and what I see here in this short time in Korea, it's easy to become very optimistic about Korea's role in the innovation space. So I have 4 points. My first point, now because I have an English version and I'm showing you one that has Korean, I'm going to make sure that I'm syncing. Give me just 1 second to sync. Yes, I'm right where I want to be. My first point, the innovation space is global. It is not country specific. Everybody that I have ever met, almost everybody, has a certain amount of pride in their own country. It's understandable. That's how we identify ourselves. or most people do. But I think this pride that we take in our own country leads us astray when we think about the innovation space. The innovation space is a global space. It is not a country-specific space. The minister who spoke just before made that very, very point, because I think he said that he was in the Vatican and he was looking at the artistic achievement, and he realized in doing so that the innovation space is global. First of all, it's pretty obvious. If it is not globally an innovation, it's not an innovation. By definition, if it is going to be the newest, the best, the most advanced, it has to be globally. It cannot be in just a specific country. Secondly, we know from our own experience in Silicon Valley that America's success over those decades, the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, in the innovation space, was based on our recognition that innovation is global. We, I think wisely, invited people from all countries of the world. People from Asian countries, people from European countries, people from Eastern European countries, people from all over the world to come and collaborate, because innovation takes place most quickly and most efficiently and most effectively and least expensively when people collaborate. Any country that tries to do this on their own will not get there as fast as those countries who collaborate. Now, in the world today, of course, we face many, many tensions. And the U.S. has not been as magnanimous in terms of its borders in the past 10 years as it used to be. Unless we, in the U.S., open our borders to innovators from around the world, our progress will slow. Innovation is global, and that is my most important point today. My second point is that on average, innovation takes place faster and better in startups than it does in big companies. Now, there can be no doubt that big multinational companies do things that are innovative from time to time. Every one of them has a big R&D department. Every one of them has a gigantic R&D budget. But we know from studying innovation over the past 50 years that it takes place least expensively, most effectively in smaller groups. On average, you can accomplish more with 4 engineers than you can with 400 engineers. On average, a big company will do as much to kill innovation as it will do to advance innovation. They don't even know they're doing it. It's subconscious. It's because a big company is wedded to the status quo. It has a huge investment in the status quo. And by virtue of human nature, we all like what is, because we benefit from it, and we can see the benefit. In every big company, innovation efforts are hampered subconsciously by people who are trying to kill them. That's why when Steve Jobs moved from the Lisa to the Macintosh, he very cleverly set up the Macintosh operation in a separate building. And he wouldn't let the Lisa people go over to that building because he knew they'd mess it up. And he even flew that legendary skull and crossbones flag, pirate flag, over the Macintosh building in order to make sure that they would be protected to innovate and not sabotaged by the protectors of the status quo. So the last thing I did when I was CEO, and in my last year of Silicon Valley Bank, I wanted to take our private bank and I wanted to make it bigger and stronger. I had to cut off all communication between the little private bank and the big bank. And I had to not let anybody interfere. And I had to take it aside and put it in its own little place and nurse it in order to protect it. And now it's doing very, very well. But innovation takes place better with few people in a small environment. That's why startups are so important. In the US, it's only 1.5% of our GDP that goes into the startup arena, and 16% of our GDP that comes out the other side. It's an amazing amount of leverage. Startups are important. And that's why all of you today here focused on the concept of startups are so important. Not just to Korea, but to the innovation space worldwide. That is my second point. And between my second point and my third point, I want to take just 2 seconds to show you some of the startups that we have financed in the US and in China. In the US, our little bank, 50th largest, almost unknown, banks over half of the venture-backed startups. So now my third point. My third point is we cannot finance every single startup. No society, no country, no venture capital fund, no bank, nobody can afford to finance every single startup. So, there has to be a selection process. Somebody has to choose who is going to be financed with debt and with equity, and who is not going to be financed with debt and equity. So different countries are going to approach this differently. I'd like to express my opinions. Everybody has to choose their own system. In my view, whoever makes those distinctions, whoever says, we're going to give equity to this company, but not to this company, and we're going to leverage that equity with debt, in this case, but not in this case, whoever does that should be doing it full time. It's a hard job. It requires concentration. It should be done full time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a little time for sleep in order to have balance so that one has mature judgment. But nothing else. Maybe a little time with the spouse, a little time with the family. But no government job, because it's too many distractions. Government has many, many responsibilities, many, many voices to answer to, many constituencies, many demands. You can't do everything. You need to focus. So the person who does that job, the people who do that job, they should be free to make their own decisions. They should work all the time. They should be smart. They should be mature. They should be kind, generous, thoughtful. And they should work hard. And they should not spend their time worrying about employment. And they should not spend their time worrying about taxes. They should spend their time worrying about which company is solving the biggest problem that will have the most beneficial impact on humanity. That's what they need to do. I think the role of the government has a big role to play, but I think government's job is building roads. I don't think government should get in the front seat, put the entrepreneurs in the back seat, and drive the car. I don't think that works. But again, everybody's free to choose their own way. I have plenty of criticisms of the way our government builds roads in America. And I'm certainly not the kind of person who's likely to tell other people what to do. But I am willing to share my observations over 32 years of financing technology startups, and those would be my observations. I think governments need to make the infrastructure sound and safe for entrepreneurs to work in. That means a reasonable tax system that benefits and encourages entrepreneurship. It means a legal system that is sound and solid so that bankers can make loans and take collateral and not worry that 10 other banks have taken the same collateral. And the list goes on. There's a long list of things government can do to make the road safe. But government cannot drive the cars if we want innovation, in my opinion. My fourth point, and this is the most difficult point to make because it's complicated underneath. On the surface, it's simple. Underneath, it's complicated. If you want, as a society, to have the biggest impact, to get the most innovation for the smallest price, you need both equity and debt. Now, equity can come from any place that will offer it, but whoever is offering equity, by definition, in my opinion, is a venture capitalist. At least if they're doing it the right way. So I'll just say you need venture capitalists. And that's a shorthand way of saying you need equity. But if all the innovation was financed with equity, it would be very, very expensive, because how do people pay for equity? With ownership. The entrepreneur starts out with 100% of his or her company. He goes to the equity provider and says, I need some equity, and the equity provider says, sure, give me 50% of your company, I'll give you equity. That's expensive. Necessary, but expensive. So you don't want to use only equity because it costs too much. Well, in some countries they say, well, then let's just use debt. That's cheap. Debt's only 6, 7, 8%. Don't have to give up ownership. Let's go that route. But if you use only debt, you're going to have big trouble. Number one is, good luck finding a banker who wants to lend money to a startup. Number two is, if you do find a banker who wants to lend money to a startup, I think it's going to be very difficult to find one that is going to want to lend all the money. If they have any sense at all, they're going to say, have some equity first. But third, if you actually found a banker that was willing to put in all the money, you'd be in a very dangerous situation, because that banker would be so nervous that they couldn't sleep at night. And they would want to talk to you 5 times a day. And every time something went wrong, they would be down your throat. And soon they would shut you down because you would have made them so nervous. So the best combination for society, for the individual entrepreneur, is a combination of equity and debt. And that's the motto that we endorse, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in 1 minute. And you're right, I'm almost done. Because now I've given you all 4 points. This is the basis of Silicon Valley Bank's approach to the world. Now, I can tell you this has been widely misunderstood because some people hear me speak and they say, oh, we want to do that too. These are bankers. And so they decide they're going to set up 2 units in their bank, the equity unit and a debt unit, and they're going to have both of them fund the startup. So 2 parts of the same bank funding the same startup. No, that's not what I said. That's very dangerous because all of our relationships at Silicon Valley Bank are triangles. There's a company, a venture capitalist, and us. And like all triangles, they're inherently unstable. Some days we like each other, some days we don't. But like many unstable relationships, there is a creative tension which can ultimately lead to success, as long as all 3 parties are different parties. So our relationships are always a venture capitalist, a company, and ourselves working together to succeed as a group, but not always on the same page and not always in complete agreement. Now I have one more slide and I show you the secret sauce of Silicon Valley Bank. I tell you this because it's free. We don't patent it. But I warn you, there is no algorithm. So there's nothing to patent. Our secret sauce is very simple, but I would say very difficult. It's taken me 32 years. I still don't quite get it. But I work at it every day. Number 1 is hard work. What we do is hard work. Any bank that wants to copy us and says if we just get that algorithm, we can start doing this stuff right away, they'll just lose money because it is hard work. It's not application of an algorithm. Number 2 is we strive very hard to have a bank with no politics. Meaning our employees are focused on only one thing: helping entrepreneurs succeed. If you have more than one goal, those goals will conflict. And if those goals conflict, you will have politics. And politics is not a good way to finance innovation. So we have no politics in our organization. Everybody at Silicon Valley Bank wakes up every single morning before the alarm clock because they're so excited. And they leap out of bed, and the first thing they think about is how can I help some entrepreneurs succeed so the world will be a better place. They don't think about their boss. They don't think about their bonus. They don't think about anything other than helping entrepreneurs succeed. Third, we don't use rules. We insist that people think. Because rules, although they have application in life, rules operate under the assumption that everything is similar. But in the real world, everything is different. So rules are guidelines, but they cannot be used the way banks use them. Instead, bankers have to think. If bankers aren't going to think about each individual situation, they cannot help entrepreneurs succeed. Fourth, a corollary to that, bankers have to focus on real risk, not imaginary risk. Some of you probably have children. If you have children, you know when they're about 3 or 4, they go through a phase where they're afraid of dragons or monsters. And my sons both, who are now in their late 20s and have children of their own, when they were little, every night I had to chase the dragons out of the closet so that they could go to sleep. In most banks, they're still chasing dragons out of closets. because they're not focused on real risks. They're focused on imaginary risks. Fifth, for a bank to do a good job with this, they have to care more about their clients than they do about themselves. If they care more about their clients than they do about themselves, they'll have happy clients, and those happy clients will insist on paying them. Sixth, they have to have regular contact. Banking, helping a startup in the innovation space is like a romance. It requires regular contact, not oppressive contact, but regular, helpful contact. And finally, focus. Everybody at Silicon Valley Bank works on the same thing. We all work on companies in the innovation space. We don't have people doing other things because we're all focused on the same activity. And that helps us all get along together better. It's really important that we all focus on the same thing. So, in conclusion, how does this apply to Korea? Well, it applies to Korea in very obvious ways. And in some respects, Korea's got lots and lots of advantages, I think, given the world the way I perceive the world. First of all, we all know Korea's got some really obvious advantages from a internet connectivity perspective. It could be at the top of the world in terms of access to the web and the number of people that go to the web daily and the broadband capacity. Korea's in good shape. Korea also has made its mark in the world already on the hardware side, but now increasingly we see Korea innovating in the areas that are gaining relevance around the world to a much greater extent than some of the older technologies, including social networking and gaming and design and lots of things that are much more futuristic. And I think that Korea has an ideal marketplace, albeit a small marketplace, but an ideal marketplace for getting started. I think that this conference is a very good indication that entrepreneurship in the way that I'm defining it is on the rise in Korea. And finally, my limited understanding based on my own research is that Korea is ahead of many countries in terms of building highways to let entrepreneurs drive cars on, a good legal system, exit opportunities in terms of established ways of executing on M&A, and established ways of taking companies public. So, can the roads be improved? Of course. But is the concept there? Clearly. So I will conclude by saying that I think Korea, in terms of my 4 points, is in good shape. Number one, having a global orientation. I think Korea is fortunate to be small. It's forced to have a global orientation. Bigger countries have a more difficult time accepting the idea that innovation is a global concept. Smaller countries like Israel and Korea can see that immediately, already one step ahead in terms of attitude. Korea clearly is recognizing that innovation takes place, I think, better, if you don't agree with me, at least admit as well, in startups as it does in big companies. I'm going to stick by better. I think it takes place better in small companies. You're here as a testimony to that. I think we will all agree that to grow and have an impact, startups need equity. And I know there's a growing venture capital community in Korea. And my final point, of course, sounds very self-serving, so I probably won't have to make it, but I do think that the best way financially to finance startups is with a combination of equity and debt. And I think that that's one thing that Korea, like most innovation markets, has opportunity to grow in, I believe. So these are my humble observations. I'll admit I've only been here 2 days now. I just want to offer my observations based on all my years of experience in other countries. I think you're a great place, great people. I'm coming back, and I want to thank you for